I'm sorry, I have to, because I love my friend Charles. I want to brutally disagree with him. This is what got us in this mess.
Design got us in the mess?
Absolutely. Herbert Muchamp put a design for a train station on the front page of the New York Times that got everyone all excited, that was $300 million over budget at the time, would probably be $1 billion over budget today, right? If we're going to be responsible designers, we can't just design beautiful stuff, hope we inspire people, and that's somehow going to wave a magic wand and change the political system. We're going to design beautiful things, and then we're going to explain to people why it's important in terms of people's basic human health and safety, why it's important in terms of economic development, why it's possible in terms of how you actually get it built. I think disaggregating design from those and this notion that you're either left brain or right brain is nutty.
Well, I'm not suggesting that, and you cut me off. You cut me off before I could get to the collaboration point of my statement. We're architects. We're collaborators by our very nature, and we were asked to do envisioning for this site. We believe that with that vision, we could team with any number of people to actually make a realizable.
Yeah, I mean,
plan.
I think, look, there's no question that I think the skeptics out there would say, how do we pay for it? We've seen projects, the Second Avenue subway is only one. A better example might be the PATH station downtown, which is insane. I mean, it's an obscene, it's unbelievable. And this is a project which is associated with sophisticated design, but which is now topping $4 billion for maybe 30,000 people. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I think, you raise a very important point, which is, yes, we are talking about design here, but I think it's important to say that whatever happens here has to be grounded in some real financial reality, and in the kinds of issues that obviously are going to concern people, whether they imagine or care about having a dignified, beautiful space worthy of New York City. One of them that struck me, I think it came up in the shop talk, was also this issue of safety. I mean, we pussyfoot around it all the time. It isn't, it is a design-related issue, but it is fundamentally a question which I think, should drive much of this conversation, and politically too. We have a place which is fundamentally dangerous for hundreds of thousands of people a day, actually at a level nobody really wants to talk about publicly. So this is this thing which we should be addressing immediately.
And the conundrum about that is, our embassies, our government buildings in Washington, D.C. have spent millions, I would say billions of dollars in putting bollards and security measures.
Yep.
It's easy to make that case if security is involved. It's, for some reason, much harder to say, how can we improve the lives of 1 million people?
Well, in King's Cross in London, which is always to me the most interesting example for all of this, you had an area which was absolutely godforsaken, given up for generations. It was an area surrounded by desolation, crime, poverty. It had 2 main rail stations. Obviously, it has King's Cross and the St. Pancras station. Over the last, 20, 25 years, you've had through private development and public initiative, the most radical transformation of probably any transit site in the West. St. Pancras Station has become in itself a destination for people, whether or not they use the Eurostar, rapid train to the continent. King's Cross has just opened, beautifully redesigned, and all around it has become a hub of economic development. So Google has decided to place its European headquarters next to the King's Cross station, right there. Couldn't have been a less likely spot 20 years ago in all of London. What prompted that? It was a fire in the King's Cross station which killed people because King's Cross was a very dangerous place, not nearly as much as Penn Station is now. I mean, is this what it takes really to push people to understand that this is not just a question of making a beautiful place, but making a safe place for people in New York.
It's visceral. I mean, people understand that. People, life, death. That we all understand that's elemental.
But until something happens, I mean, I tend to agree with you. Until something happens, to push a button somewhere in some machinery, it probably won't be. That won't be the primary motivation.
I hope not. But I think we could. I mean, I think we should agree whether that this is. It just is not Madison Square Garden versus Penn Station. It's not design versus infrastructure. It's not capacity versus a better building.
Right.
It can't be that, or it won't.
Right.
It just
Exactly.
won't. It won't move forward. All of you have had experience with the West Side, and I think it's not clear maybe to everybody here the ways in which one sees the West Side changing. You all alluded to it, to Hudson Yards, to the High Line, and perhaps the extension of the High Line, you know, the development possibly of a pier, but maybe you could just pull back for a little bit and just describe how do we imagine the West Side developing in the next quarter of a century, which would create a context for Penn Station. Anybody want to take that? Well, we have all, I mean.
You know, if we had trains running as fast as the Chinese Harmony train, we would make it from downtown New York to downtown Charlotte in about 3 hours, downtown to downtown, right? There's 1 million air passengers today between Charlotte and New York City. I raise this because, to me, this isn't just a question. Part of like the issue with the Berlin Hauptbahnhof that I found very, very strange is you get out and you're not really in the center of the city, right?
Right.
You're sort of in this sort of this sort of no man's land.
Correct.
I think the real potential with the West Side, with Penn Station at its hub, is that in a land of high-speed rail, when it's going to be faster and faster to move from downtown to downtown, that downtown becomes the absolute destination for where you want to get when you want to get off the train. Right now, most people are getting off at Penn Station and then getting on a subway or taxi to go somewhere else because they're leaving the district, right? But every ingredient is there to reverse that situation where the West Side becomes in some ways the real gateway for New York City for the entirety of the Northeast Corridor.
Yeah.
I mean, we work on the West Side, on the West Side Highway, and I also live there. By the way, my apartment was blown up in 3 of the schemes today. I'm putting it on the market tomorrow. But I would say that
But not yours.
Whose apartment did you blow up, Charles?
I would say, we'll talk later. I would say that having worked there, having built there, having designed there, and currently thinking about the densification project that's happening, I do think it's woefully underserved by local transit. I mean, you know, we have 100 employees and they all walk to work from their subway stations. It takes them 15 minutes to walk. If we're going to densify the West Side, it's going to take more than the number 7 line. It's going to take other infrastructural investment that I think, you know, could maybe it doesn't have to be subway, but there could be other things to help move and keep people on the West Side.
Right. I mean, I think I was actually all to take an even bigger step back to explain Hudson Yards, to explain the impact of the High Line, so people understand here what the West Side is going to look like or might look like if development continues. That's really what I was asking.
Yeah, I think some of it's clear. I mean, there's the upzoning of Hudson Yards and the High Line work and the High Line extension, but there's other very large developments that remain opaque. For instance, the Port Authority bus terminal and all the land holdings of the port relative to the ramps and the entrance to the tunnel, which will be massive, and it's like an octopus. And its tentacles extend into the Hudson Yards development and virtually touch Penn Station and also the park that they're creating in Hudson Yards. So who knows what that is, but it will be large, and it's not determined what that should be. But you know, imagine, you know, if we're imagining things today, you know, some kind of interior connection between whatever that ends up being, one of those tentacles, and Penn Station. So, you know, amazing things. And then
we wouldn't have to touch Port Authority building though, would we? Because
you just love it so much.
oh, we love it. Yeah, here in the Times building, we love looking out on the Port Authority.
It's a landmark, isn't it?
It's a landmark. Yeah.
Like the fact that it's parking on top. Right?
Yes, the beautiful parking lot is great.
But those are planned redevelopments and planned upzonings, and they're going to be massive. But what about all the collateral developments? So many of the schemes showed collateral development, and it will be massive. You know, this is going to be the new 21st century Midtown, you know, looking out 50 years probably. But, you know, Grand Central, that area around there, is going to seem quaint, I think, by comparison relative to the scale of what's going to happen here. So this will be massive.
And you believe that will happen?
Yeah, it will happen. And, you know, this could be a 21st century center, Penn Station, and a new Port Authority to all this development.
Because what about the extension of the High Line? What do you make of that idea of bringing it
It's great.
farther?
Well, I would say, and with all deference to Charles and Liz and you know, Dilcia Video, is the idea that, you know, think about the history of New York. The whole West Side was unwanted land. That was the port. That was business. That was warehouses. Remember, you know, it was Death Avenue, 12th Avenue, is all the push carts and trains and things. You fear for your life crossing that because of all the business of what made New York strong was happening there. It was, for the general public, it was a place that was beyond our thought. That was really kind of the first phase. When manufacturing started to decline, we started, hey, we've got all this land, we've got all this shoreline that we could actually access. We could get to that. And you know, I think Dilcia Video Renfro, the idea that you could convert old industrial infrastructure into public space, that was part of that second wave.
Well,
I think we're now going into a third wave, this idea of looking at the waterfront as a civic place, a civic space, that there's a new culture of being down at the water and having it an integral part of civic life. We're doing Pier A, the restoration of Pier A down at the Battery. And you know, that was the old fire boat warehouse. No one had ever been in that who wasn't a fireman or a city employee for over 100 years. We're just about to restore it and finish it, and it's an incredible amenity, and right there in front of us. It's always been there.
If I could, about the High Line.
Yeah.
The High Line was a piece of infrastructure, but it's no longer a piece of infrastructure. It's a place of repose. And I think it's an interesting idea to think to extend it, but I actually don't think it's exactly appropriate to try to turn it back into a piece of infrastructure now that it's...
Even if it's a pedestrian piece of infrastructure?
No, actually not. I think what people are trying to do is get off the hook for making new transportation on the West Side that will be needed to make the West Side viable in the density that's being proposed. I think it's a substitute infrastructural approach.
I mean, I know what Charles is saying. I mean, you have to be careful when you're talking about extensions of the High Line. We looked at this, we tried to look at this very gingerly in the sense that we do feel that spur that hangs over 10th Avenue at 30th Street kind of ends rather abruptly. And it does seem like, you know, Penn Station's right there, right? And it's interesting in terms of the logic of the garden. Because in 2007, one of their issues was, well, how far are we getting from the transportation?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I mean, Barclays Center doesn't sit on top of the transportation, it actually sits some distance from it, but there's a gracious way to move. And again, given the grade changes, we felt that on-grade park, and a really beautiful on-grade park that could set off the Farley building, help bring light into the stations, but where one could convince the garden, Greg showed that one image where, you know, you came out of the station, it was very clear how you moved up that park onto the High Line. I also think that, you know, for the garden, that if there's an event going on and people are walking up from Chelsea on the High Line and so forth, you know, so I think that you do have to do it very judiciously.
I mean,
I think there's
loading up all the 20,000 people on the High Line is like putting 620,000 people in Madison Square Garden when it was designed for 120,000. It's just not really the right approach.
Well, they're just in that stretch. They're not going further south.
But they won't. I mean, I don't know that that's not going to happen. But anyway.
No. This is interesting. And as for the pier, since you mentioned this, originally it occurred to me when Governor Cuomo had proposed the idea of moving the convention center, having a convention center built out in Jamaica and closing Javits that this was actually itself a potential site, at least as a provocation to talk about where the garden might move at the end of the number 7 train. You keep the Javits Center and see that in some ways as paired with a new garden on an extended pier.
We think there's a possible synergy there. I mean, the idea that Javits could expand in place has been studied. FX Fowl, Richard Rogers, they had come up with a scheme 5 years ago that would expand it above and create a much larger convention center hall right where it is now. But really the issue was, how do you permeate that? How do you get to the water from the upland side? Javits has always been considered this wall.
Yeah.
This mute
It is a
kind
wall.
of space. It is. But there are ways to get up and over it, go through it, perhaps go under it with transit, that we thought maybe there's a way to make it a bit less of a frontal.
I mean, it'd be nice to have that be re-knit into the streetscape, because that just becomes a dead zone by virtue of it being. And with the High Line ending there, you're going to have, in Hudson Yards, you're going to have that much more demand for pedestrian traffic. And so Javits, which is outmoded anyway, seems like something that will eventually have to change and could become
Well, but I would say,
different.
one of the things that because we were thinking about the incentive idea, that we can try to force MSG to move. Wouldn't it be better to try and find a way to get them comfortable with the idea of moving?
Well, so you bringing up this issue of going there reminds me, of course, that we had a stadium proposal as well on the west side, and this, if I remember, didn't work out. So, okay, so again, what went wrong there, and why is this going to be different?
I think it's this idea that
I'm not asking. Yes, please answer, but I'm not just challenging you on the pier. I'm just asking in a general sense to all of you as well.
Isn't it time to think about the city in a different way? I mean, the High Line suggests a more layered condition. Grand Central, its genius, suggests a more layered condition. And why do we have to talk about a stadium on a site, or the convention center on a site, or Madison Square Garden on a site? Why aren't we talking about these things in combination? The convention center with a living city above it. Isn't it time to recalibrate, the definition of site in New York City? I think the future suggests that yes is the answer, and maybe the High Line is a symbol of that future. I don't know.
Well, I think you all have agreed with that in the sense that you're all creating these very complex multi-use sites. But maybe I could just go back for 1 second, force somebody, looking at you again. But the stadium didn't work, and the difference is?
I think one of the things that we all learned is that, arenas are fundamentally urban things, right? I mean, basketball, concerts, even though there's a lot of controversy around the Barclays Center, I think the Barclays Center is added to the urban life of that part of Brooklyn. It was interesting with the stadium, one of the first questions that the city would always get is, where's the tailgating going to go? And I think there's something about football that is a very different, it's understood as a more suburban sport. And so I do think there's a distinction
Well,
between
it's smaller.
It's smaller. I mean,
it can go underground partly, and you have events that are taking place often every night, as opposed to.
I also don't believe anyone believed that you could build a football stadium without building parking for it. Whereas, I mean, Barclays Center and the Garden prove you can have arenas that don't have parking, and I think those are big urban issues. And so I do think there's a big distinction between the two.
I see our time has run up, but I bet there are lots of questions, so I want to open it up to the floor. And if you ask a question, could you go to the speaker? So I think maybe line up is the traditional way of doing it. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a comment that you all mentioned Grand Central Terminal in the most glowing of terms, and that is a building that's 100 years old, Beaux-Arts architecture, functions on a multi-level layer, and so on and so forth. So I just would hope that this dialogue could also not be so negative towards the possibility of what historical buildings can do and historic-looking architecture. It seems to be labeled backward all the time, yet St. Pancras is an old building that's functioning beautifully. So I just think that it's important for you or others to just keep that as part of the conversation, because if you ask a lot of New Yorkers, I think they want something that's accessible, and sometimes buildings like that feel more accessible to people than sometimes the pushing the envelope stuff kind of does. And the second comment is that I just think it's important. You know, a lot of people say, well, a lot of these new buildings, do you really feel that there's going to be demand for all that office space over time with everything coming online? I mean, maybe over 100 years, but over the next 25 to 30 years?
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to comment on either of those?
I think my particular comments about Grand Central weren't about style or its architectural design. It's more as a piece of engineering. William Wilgus, who designed it, conceived brilliantly of the layers and, you know, suppressing the tracks and ramping down from the street and all of that. And I think that kind of conceptual genius is what we need on Penn Station site. It wasn't about style, architectural style.
I guess I was also asking the question about how much development there actually will be, but this is art, and we're not futurologists. Yeah.
Hi, Charles. I'm also in the neighborhood, and 3 of the schemes took my place out too. I'm sympathetic to.
Shall
your
we join
situation.
forces?
Indeed. But one of the things that strikes me about this, insofar as what we're looking at now, is we're figuring between what's going on in Hudson Yards, north of Hudson Yards, and around, like 1 million more people are going to be working in that area, and 500,000 more people are going to be living there, which are going to be therefore citizens in the old-fashioned sense, what people call residents now. And I'm curious, as this term of public realm comes back again and again, are we ready to think all the way back to where the town square would be for this new microcosm of the megacity? You know, where's the place to exercise freedom of assembly in this mix?
That's a good question. Anybody want to take it on? I mean, do you see the station itself? Some of you had this, obviously,
Yeah.
many of you had an idea of green space or open space.
I would say for us, it's actually the station, that in fact that is a civic space that is public in nature. It's not a privately owned, or I mean, it probably will be in the end, but the essence of this is that it's a public space, a public forum, and weaves sort of unconventionally perhaps green space and places of assembly within its fibers. I mean, I think other people up here anticipated more green space or open space within the district.
Yeah, I think it's time for a rethink about what public is. And if any of you were at the Grand Central presentation, it's discussed, there's something called POPS, POPs they call them, and Midtown zoning, where it's privately owned public space is what it's called. So all those little pocket parks and things. And so it's characterized loosely as public, but it's not public at all, it's private. And I do think it's time for clarification on what public means in the public realm. And is it truly public, or is it sort of qualified public? So I think that's the heart of the issue here, and many of us have drawn parks and open space, and all that, but you know, is it public or is it qualified public? Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeff Zupan with Regional Plan Association, one of the co-conspirators on all of this. I wanted to ask I wanted to make this point. I think we can all agree that Madison Square Garden today is very well located from a public transportation point of view, all the subway lines as well as the railroads below it. And each of you proposes a different place to put Madison Square Garden. And I think it's extremely important that the quality and the range of public transit options that are at the new place, one of these 4 new places, be, if not as good, because it's going to be very difficult to be as good, to be as close as possible to be adequate, so that the idea of moving Madison Square Garden makes sense from a Madison Square Garden point of view. And I think it would be important, and some of you do to varying degrees address that issue. And I think it's very important that conversation continue.
Did any of you feel that you did not adequately address that issue?
I think that I might be able to answer that.
Yeah, please. No, but you did do.
I think, well, I would say that the first proposal understands that that's a problem by putting it on the water and suggests a series of improvements, all of which are going to be very expensive. And I'm not going to comment at this point as to how doable they are, but certainly acknowledge the fact that that has to be addressed. I think that each of the other proposals moves Madison Square Garden, by moving it off of its current site, reduces the accessibility of Madison Square Garden to various degrees. You can argue as to whether it moves it so far off that it's really an issue. Vishaan made the point that Barclays is not right on the site, and that as long as the movement from wherever it is to the station area is pleasant and adequate and not too long, then it might be able to work. So
I mean,
I would just argue that it's, standing where you are, Jeff, it's easier to see that tree than understand what's on top of you, right? And so I would argue that it's actually not the best situation for Madison Square Garden to be sitting directly on top of the transportation, but actually in some place that's co-located, that's fairly easy to find, that's a fairly gracious walk, right? Having to figure out how to get and spiral up into this thing that's sitting right on top of you, I think is really challenging.
I don't disagree with that, but the question is whether it's 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet. When does it become too
They're
far?
sports fans.
No matter how good the design. When does it become
They've
too
just been
far, no matter
tailgating.
how good the design?
They haven't been
That's the
tailgating.
issue.
That's another sport, Charles.
I mean, no, I mean, obviously this is a very important question. It's crucial for the garden to feel that it is
Teach me later.
not being the sacrificial one in this case. Having said that from the very beginning, I mean, if I could stick in my own 2 cents here, you know, and it comes up in this relation to the last question about the public realm. The garden, which gets tax breaks every year from us and gets enormous benefits, of course, by being on top of that, should benefit by moving. But ultimately, as a democratic society, we have to somehow be able to weigh the benefits to 600,000 people a day versus the uses of a single building owned by someone for the use of a few thousand people who use it a day. I mean, something's got to give. No, is there, unless there's a magical solution in which everything is equally divided always?
If I could just respond
Yeah.
on a related matter. The 600,000 number has been used repeatedly today. It's not the correct number, and it's lower than that. It doesn't mean it's not significant. It's highly significant. It's about 375,000. We can have that debate, but I think that one of the things that we should do from the credibility point of view is be able to use the correct numbers, because the Madison Square Garden people are obviously opposed to this, and to whatever extent that it can reduce our credibility collectively is something that's going to work in their favor. So I'd be pleased to talk to MAS and everyone else, and let's start using the correct number.
That sounds
Not
good.
600,000.
Jeff, could I also add to that? You're right, it's 375 for rail passengers, but I would add the 150,000, 200,000 that ride the subways on all the lines that surround. The people who are coming in on Amtrak, which is about 100,000, and the 200,000 people who live within 10001 and 10018 zip codes that surround the area. That's 1 million people.
There's
that
double
every
counting
day
going on.
are
That should
related.
be resolved, though. There's
But this is a good point in any case, to be good about the numbers and to make sure the garden is dealt with properly. Yeah, fairly.
Hi. I think that everybody here, from what you all say, you're in agreement that every private development or even private-public partnership, every one of those things is an opportunity to solve a public problem. And I really think that at this point that with regard to New York City's, the state of New York City housing, as a social worker myself and someone who's interested in this kind of thing, I think that this project is a good opportunity. I was hearing you talking about the mixed use of the buildings that would go along with the rail station. And so I'm thinking, well, there's another opportunity to have several million square feet of apartment space that's dedicated not to people that can afford the current luxury housing that is being built now, but to solve the problem of doubling up and homelessness and all of this that I see in my work daily. If you look at the NYU Furman Center, they have a statistic that there are